Now approaching about year 9 of Democrats suffering from Trump Derangement Syndrome. No matter what is before this House, no matter what the rule before us today actually contains, my colleagues across the aisle find a way to make this about President Trump. Not the substance of the legislation, not the issues before the American people, not the suffering that the last 4 years have brought on them. Not the costs facing families, not the failures of their own record. It's just about Trump to them. And while they're fixated on that, the American people have paid the price. In 2022, while Democrats were consumed by their latest Trump obsession, families were being crushed by the worst inflation spikes in 40 years after trillions upon trillions in Democratic spending overheated the economy. Groceries, gas, rent, they all skyrocketed. You didn't hear a peep on the other side.
So here we are once again with this specimen standing at a microphone in what I can only assume is the suffocating atmosphere of the House floor, where the air itself seems thick with Republican projection and that particular brand of gaslighting that has become not just a tactic, but a theology. And you've just heard him, haven't you? This congressman, whose name hardly matters because he could be any of dozens of identically programmed automatons who've learned to recite the catechism of victimhood while wielding actual power, accusing Democrats of suffering from Trump Derangement Syndrome as if the phrase itself weren't a perfect crystallization of how thoroughly conservatives have weaponized dismissiveness, how they've turned legitimate concern about an authoritarian threat into a punchline for their base to chortle over while democracy burns in the background. And I need you to understand something absolutely fundamental before we go any further into this analysis, because what you're about to hear is not just commentary, but an excavation of the most insidious rhetorical maneuver in contemporary American politics. Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in May 2024, and the man at that podium wants you to believe that Democrats are obsessed, that this is all theater, all performance art from a party consumed by irrational hatred when Special Counsel Jack Smith charged Trump with conspiring to overturn the results of the 2020 election and spreading claims about voter fraud that he knew to be false. And here's where the cognitive dissonance reaches levels that would be comedic if they weren't so catastrophically dangerous, because this Republican representative is literally standing there complaining about Democrats making everything about Trump while Trump himself attempted to destroy the peaceful transfer of power, while to the indictment accuses Trump of spreading lies that there had been outcome-determinative fraud in the election, ultimately leading to the Jan point. And we're supposed to believe that noticing this, that responding to this, that dedicating legislative attention to preventing future coups constitutes a syndrome rather than basic democratic self-preservation. The sheer audacity of it staggers the mind. But here's what's even more diabolical, and you need to lean in for this, because it's about to get even more infuriating when he pivots to inflation, when he starts talking about families being crushed and groceries and gas and rent skyrocketing under Democratic spending. He's deploying what historians of fascism would recognize immediately as the classic authoritarian deflection, where you accuse your opponents of the very distraction you're perpetrating. After the Inflation Reduction Act passed, inflation didn't rise, it fell. Although this was mostly for reasons other than the act itself. Since August 2022, when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, prices have risen by 6.4%, but wages have risen faster by 8.5%, meaning consumers have come out ahead. But facts have never been Republicans' strong suit, have they? Not when there's a narrative to construct, not when there's fear to weaponize. And let's talk about this inflation argument for a moment, because it reveals everything about how Republicans have been running the same playbook for 7 decades, literally the same script with different actors, because since the 1950s, the GOP has simplified the causes of inflation in order to blame Democrats, resurrecting the tactic that worked so well between the 1950s and early 1980s, exaggerating the perceived impacts, and insisting it had only one source, government spending. This isn't analysis, this is historical pattern recognition. This is understanding that when this congressman talks about trillions in Democratic spending overheating the economy, he's not engaging in economic discourse, but participating in a ritualized performance that has been perfected across generations of conservative politicians who discovered that blaming Democrats for inflation works politically regardless of economic reality, that this maneuver generates the misleading impression that Democrats created inflation and that Republicans would somehow fix the problem, convincing many Americans that there was a much bigger problem than actually existed. But here's the truly chilling part, and I want you to feel the full weight of this, because while this representative was performing his little theatrical production about Democrats being obsessed with Trump, Harvard professor Stephen Levitsky, co-author of How Democracies Die, stated we've slid into some form of authoritarianism, noting it is relatively mild compared to some others, and certainly reversible, but that we are no longer living in a liberal democracy, and the survey of more than 500 political scientists finds that the vast majority think the United States is moving swiftly from liberal democracy toward some form of authoritarianism, with scholars giving American democracy a rating of 67 after Trump's election in November, which plummeted to 55 several weeks into Trump's second term. So when you hear this congressman mock Trump derangement syndrome, understand that he's not just dismissing democratic concerns, he's participating in the normalization of authoritarian creep. He's providing cover for what experts describe as Trump openly admiring authoritarians around the world and pledging to rule like one, with the authoritarian playbook for 2025 examining the promises, powers, and plans of a second Trump presidency. The syndrome isn't Democratic obsession with Trump. The syndrome is Republican refusal to acknowledge what's happening in plain sight, their willful blindness to Trump making over 100 threats to prosecute or punish perceived enemies during his 2024 campaign, their enabling of someone who promised to root out communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, language that any student of 20th century totalitarianism would recognize immediately as echoing the dehumanizing rhetoric that precedes political violence. Now let's address the elephant in the room, that this congressman so conveniently ignores while he's up there pontificating about democratic failures and suffering families. Because yes, inflation hurt people. Yes, economic anxiety is real. But the American Rescue Plan, which Democrats, including senators, passed a year earlier, likely contributed to worsening inflation. But it was not the sole cause. And more importantly, you know what also causes political instability and economic suffering? Attempted coups. You know what's bad for markets and families and the social fabric? When a recorded phone call captures a president pressing a Secretary of State to find votes to flip an election. When democratic norms collapse. When 67% of Republicans trust Trump but only 51% trust the electoral system, meaning Trump has successfully positioned himself as more credible than the electoral process within one of our two major political parties. This is what makes the Trump derangement syndrome accusation so pernicious, so genuinely dangerous, because it's not just an insult, it's a strategic discrediting of legitimate democratic alarm. It's telling people that their eyes are lying to them, that their concern about Trump planning to abuse the Insurrection Act, to order military force to quash dissent and target vulnerable communities, is irrational, that noticing when Project 2025 provides a roadmap to destroy the governing structures and norms of liberal democracy through mass purges of civil servants who are not loyalists and create autocracy, somehow makes you deranged rather than observant. And the inflation critique. Oh, this is where it gets really good in terms of sheer cynical manipulation, because nearly 80% of clean energy jobs from climate legislation went to Republican-held House districts, meaning the very spending Republicans demonize is creating jobs in their districts, and $116 billion worth of climate-friendly tech manufacturing investments have been announced since passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, creating 99,500 projected jobs. But does this congressman mention that? Does he acknowledge that Democratic spending is literally rebuilding American manufacturing in red districts? Of course not, because that would undermine the narrative, that would require intellectual honesty, that would mean admitting that governance is complex, and that sometimes investments that cause short-term inflationary pressure create long-term economic stability and job growth. But let's zoom out even further, because what you're witnessing in this clip is not an isolated incident, but a microcosm of how authoritarianism takes root in democracies, how it happens gradually and then suddenly, how Trump's return to the White House signals a significant breakdown of an already battered democracy, according to experts, with much of the electorate seeing him as democracy's savior. And this is the crucial point that should terrify anyone paying attention, because authoritarian movements don't succeed by announcing themselves as authoritarian. They succeed by convincing people that the real threat comes from those warning about authoritarianism. They succeed by making accountability look like obsession, by making documentation of crimes look like persecution, by making defense of democratic norms look like Trump derangement syndrome. The congressman's complaint about Democrats focusing on Trump rather than the issues before the American people is particularly rich when you consider that Dick Cheney has asserted that in the nation's 248-year history, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to the republic than Donald Trump, with the bipartisan condemnation including Trump's own former vice president and cabinet members. When Mike Pence, Trump's own vice president, refuses to endorse him and claims that anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president, maybe, just maybe, Democratic focus on Trump isn't a syndrome, but a rational response to an unprecedented threat. When 9 out of 10 Republican presidential and vice presidential candidates have refused to back Trump's candidacy, and 91% of his former cabinet members didn't endorse his primary run, perhaps the derangement is among those still supporting him, not those alarmed by him. And here's what absolutely enrages me about this entire rhetorical strategy, this entire gaslighting operation masquerading as congressional speech, because while this representative is up there complaining that Democrats make every debate about Trump, Trump himself has announced his intention to be a dictator. Trump himself has praised Viktor Orban's authoritarian regime in Hungary. Trump himself has said he is Maradi Ibaltor, where he has the right to do whatever he wants as president. And we're supposed to just ignore this. We're supposed to focus on appropriations bills and procedural matters while someone who attempted a coup returns to power. The call is coming from inside the House, and Republicans are complaining that Democrats keep mentioning the intruder. Let me lay out what's actually happening here in terms that cut through the obfuscation, because this is about power and who gets to define reality. This is about a political movement that has learned that if you repeat accusations of obsession and derangement enough times, if you make caring about democracy seem hysterical and unhinged, you can normalize the abnormal. You can make coups seem like policy disagreements. You can transform an attempted authoritarian takeover into just another political controversy where both sides have a point. This is the paradox of tolerating intolerance that Karl Popper warned us about. This is the infinite regress of liberal proceduralism, where Democrats are expected to treat existential threats to democracy as matters for polite debate, while Republicans are free to undermine the entire system while complaining about Democrats' tone. In the previous Trump administration, his own cabinet members and others inside the White House often challenged Trump's most destructive directives, but this time he is choosing loyalists who will never provide resistance, with a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, meaning the judiciary is unlikely to provide substantial check on his power, and his threats of retribution against disloyal civil servants and military officers likely limiting resistance in those institutions. This congressman knows this, every Republican knows this, and their strategy is to prevent Democrats from building a political coalition to resist by painting that resistance as irrational, by making Trump Derangement Syndrome the frame rather than Trump's authoritarian ambitions. The inflation argument is particularly galling because research shows negative economic shocks cause the adoption of authoritarian values through a frustration-aggression mechanism, with the inflationary period from 2020 to 2024 being one such shock, and scholars of fascism's rise in Europe point to the important role played by inflation that took hold in Austria and Germany during the 1920s in explaining how Hitler came to power, arguing that soaring price rises could lead to political radicalization. Republicans are weaponizing economic anxiety to enable authoritarianism, while simultaneously blaming Democrats for the conditions that make authoritarianism appealing. It's a perfectly closed loop of cynicism, a perpetual motion machine of bad faith where they create the conditions for democratic breakdown while accusing Democrats of obsessing over the person engineering that breakdown. And we need to talk about projection, that Freudian concept that conservatives have turned into their primary mode of political communication, because when this congressman accuses Democrats of making everything about Trump instead of substance, instead of issues, instead of the suffering of American families, he is describing Republican strategy with pixel-perfect accuracy. Republicans have spent 9 years making everything about Trump, building an entire party apparatus around loyalty to one man, purging anyone who challenges him, but they project that obsession onto Democrats as if responding to threats is the same as creating them, as if documentation is equivalent to instigation, as if saying the emperor has no clothes and also attempted a coup is somehow more divisive than the nakedness and the coup itself. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, expert on authoritarianism, warns that Trump is a master propagandist who has taken people step by step for almost a decade to view democracy as an inferior system, with Project 2025 being the roadmap to destroy the governing structures and norms of liberal democracy through mass purges of civil servants who are not loyalists to create autocracy. And this congressman wants us to believe that Democrats are the ones obsessed, that Democrats are the ones making everything about Trump, when Trump has literally made himself the gravitational center of American politics, when he has constructed a cult of personality so totalizing that Republican senators who privately despise him vote in lockstep with his agenda, when he has bent an entire political party to his will through threats and intimidation and the promise of maintaining power through increasingly anti-democratic means. The suffering families that this representative mentions, the crushing weight of inflation that he describes, these are real, And Democrats should absolutely be held accountable for how they've communicated about economic policy, for how they've sometimes seemed disconnected from material struggle. But Republicans are not offering solutions. They're offering a strongman who promises to make the pain go away through force, through purging enemies, through dismantling the administrative state. Experts point to Hungary as a prime example of Trump's model of authoritarianism, where Viktor Orban has undermined courts, press freedoms, and minority rights to create what he touts as an illiberal democracy. Then that's not a solution to inflation. That's the end of the democratic experiment that has made American prosperity possible in the first place. I want you to understand the stakes here, because this isn't abstract, this isn't academic political science, this is about what kind of country we're going to be, and whether we're going to be a country at all in any recognizable sense. When over the past 20 years, there has been no shortage of examples of democracies deteriorating and moving toward authoritarianism in a worldwide retreat from democracy, with this backsliding concerning recent and less secure democracies, but also affecting established democracies. We need to recognize that American exceptionalism is not a force field, that our democratic norms are not self-enforcing, that they depend on people in power choosing to uphold them and on citizens demanding that they do so. This congressman's speech is not just wrong, it's dangerous in a specific and documentable way, because it's designed to create permission structures for authoritarian governance. It's designed to make you doubt your own perception of threat. It's designed to make democratic resistance seem shrill and unreasonable, so that when Trump starts actually implementing his authoritarian agenda, people will have been so conditioned to dismiss concerns as Trump Derangement Syndrome that they won't be able to mobilize effective opposition until it's too late, until the damage is done, until we're living in what political scientists would classify as competitive authoritarianism, where elections still happen, but the playing field has been tilted so thoroughly that real democratic alternation becomes impossible. And the final layer of this that I need you to grasp is how this all connects to the broader conservative project of making government dysfunction self-fulfilling. Because Republicans obstruct governance, they prevent solutions to real problems like inflation and immigration and healthcare. They block democratic initiatives, and then they campaign on the failures they've engineered. They point to problems they've exacerbated, and say, see, government doesn't work. We need a strong leader who can cut through all this bureaucracy and just get things done, which is always, in every historical instance, the language that precedes authoritarian consolidation of power. Democracy is slow and messy and frustrating, and Republicans have learned to weaponize that frustration, to turn the inherent difficulty of pluralistic governance into evidence that pluralistic governance should be abandoned. Larry Diamond writes that the greatest risk to democracy is the empowerment of strong leaders who sideline or undermine established institutions and constraints like Congress, courts, media, and political opposition in the name of getting things done, with heads of state from Erdogan in Turkey to Orban in Hungary, creating blueprints for how to suffocate democratic pluralism and entrench autocracy, and that's the actual context for this congressman's speech. That's what he's providing cover for, whether he understands it or not, whether he's a true believer or just someone who's decided that his political advancement matters more than democratic preservation. So no, Democrats do not suffer from Trump Derangement Syndrome. They suffer from being forced to defend democratic norms against opponents who have given up on democracy, while simultaneously being accused of being divisive for pointing out that opponents have given up on democracy. They suffer from having to explain that yes, economic policy matters, but so does whether we're going to have free and fair elections, so does whether the next president will use the Insurrection Act against protesters, so does whether the Justice Department will be weaponized against political opponents, so does whether we'll still have a free press that can criticize the government without facing license challenges and tax audits and the full force of state retaliation. The derangement is not in noticing the coup. The derangement is in pretending the coup didn't happen while supporting the coup leader's return to power. The derangement is standing at a podium in Congress and accusing Democrats of obsessing over Trump, while Trump's own former officials warn that he's a threat to the republic. The derangement is choosing party over country, choosing power over principle, choosing the temporary political advantage of dismissing legitimate concerns over the long-term project of maintaining American democracy. And ultimately what makes me angry, what should make you angry, what should drive us to organize and resist and build political power, is that this rhetoric works, this gaslighting is effective, because it preys on exhaustion, on the natural human desire to believe that things aren't as bad as they seem, on the hope that maybe Democrats are overreacting. Maybe it won't be that bad. Maybe we can just focus on normal politics and normal issues and everything will work out. But history teaches us that things can be that bad, that democracies do fail, that authoritarians do consolidate power, and that they do so most effectively when people who should know better enable them, defend them, run interference for them, and accuse those sounding the alarm of suffering from a syndrome. We are 9 years into this now, 9 years since Trump descended that golden escalator and began his assault on truth and democratic norms, and Republicans are still acting like Democrats are the unreasonable ones for taking him at his word, for believing him when he tells us who he is and what he plans to do. The syndrome is not Democratic vigilance. The syndrome is Republican complicity dressed up as pragmatism, dressed up as focusing on the real issues, dressed up as rejecting elite hysteria, when what it actually represents is a political party that has decided that holding power by any means necessary matters more than preserving the system that makes holding power meaningful in the first place. This congressman is not defending families crushed by inflation. He's defending a movement that will crush democracy itself, and calling attention to that isn't derangement, it's the minimum requirement of democratic citizenship.